Abbey administered justice and pocketed every fine it took. It ran the Royal Mint. Being abbot of Bury St Edmunds was literally a licence to print money. The abbey even owned the very horse droppings on the street, and the monks took their cut of that. Every abbot jealously guarded his monopoly. Take Abbot Samson, for example, who ruled Bury with a rod of iron in the late 12th century. One day he heard that his dean Herbert had built a windmill without his permission. The abbot was more than a little miffed. In fact, his biographer tells us Samson boiled with fury and could hardly eat or sleep. He summoned Herbert and said, "I thank you as much as if you had cut off both my feet. By the face of God, I will never eat bread until that building is destroyed." Well, it was a subtle enough hint, but Herbert took it and destroyed the mill immediately. As a rich landowner, the Abbot of Bury was supposed to marshal a small army for the king. Well, Abbot Samson had no problem with that. In 1193, he personally donned armour and led his troops in the siege of Windsor, fighting for Richard I against his brother John. The poor old St Benedict and his rulebook must have been turning in their graves.
There was this paradox at the heart of medieval monasticism.
One of the driving forces behind monasticism was the idea that as monks led purer, simpler, more austere lives, their prayers were worth more than other folks. Of course, the purer, simpler, more austere a monastery was, the more it attracted wealth from rich clients anxious for it to say their prayers for them. The irony was that the wealthier a monastery became, the less pure, simple and austere its lifestyle became, and hence less valuable its prayers. It was a vicious circle.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So a new breed of monk would take monasticism back to basics. Here on the North Yorkshire moors, a group of monks arrived from the French abbey of Clairvaux in 1132.
These monks had come to get back to the basics of St Benedict's rule and enjoy lives of abject poverty, vegetarianism and strict discipline. They called themselves Cistercians and wore white robes to symbolise purity. They also wore no underpants to symbolise, well, I'm not quite sure what that symbolised, but St Benedict hadn't mentioned anything about underpants, and so the Cistercians would have no truck with the things. Some call it bare-bottomed piety. The Cistercians were determined to worship God not only without underpants, but in the most remote and uninhabited places. At the start, there were just 12 monks and an abbot living here in wooden huts. But within 20 years, the wooden huts were a distant memory.
They named the new monastery Rievaulx, and many more were soon to follow.
The Cistercians were more than a religious movement. They were a brand. They invented a sort of Mac monasticism, a worldwide franchise in which uniformity was the key. The same books, the same food, the same customs, the same clothes, the same architecture. It's said that a blind monk from Scotland could find his way around a Cistercian monastery in Scandinavia.
Archaeologist Glyn Coppack has been examining Cistercian monasteries all over Britain. He explains how the neighbouring Fountains Abbey was constructed.
So, Glyn, how were the Cistercians getting back to basics?
Well, they were simplifying their architecture. They spent a long time getting it right. So you have simple pillars with pointed arches. And to add to the austerity, the whole thing is painted white. You can still see looking around us where the weather hasn't taken it off because it's very, very fragile. But the whole thing would have shone inside.
So this kind of symbolic purity.
Oh, absolutely. And in the windows, plain glass, no coloured glass.
How do you know they had plain glass?
Well, we've got some. Here's some
Coincidence?
we found earlier. You see, it's just a
You're happy
plain
to touch it?
green glass, yes? No colour in there.
Yeah.
And you don't see very many of these. This is a processional cross. This would normally be gold or silver. This is iron. It's as simple as you can get.
Now, why are they doing this? Who is this going to appeal to? This sort of this kind of austerity that they're putting
Well,
up?
the simpler the religion, the harder the life, the more powerful the prayers. And the people they're appealing to are those who need the salvation more than most. The military classes, professional soldiers.
The mill, the brewery, the kitchens and the latrines of the monastery were all fed by a sophisticated water supply.
And in fact, when you go into the cloister, water comes out there in taps like this.
A tap.
It's got a tap.
It's got a little Celtic beast's head there. I've seen the holes there. Oh, I see. So that's off, and then to get the water coming through, you just turn it like that, and the water flows through.
That's right.
And then when you finish, you turn it back up,
again.
and it stops. That's brilliant. And so what date is this?
That's about 1170. Now, this is the sort of thing that many of us didn't have until about 1920 in our own homes.
The Cistercians weren't poor monks who arrived in Yorkshire by chance. The whole thing was run to a centrally coordinated business plan, and they were ruthless with anyone who happened to get in the way. One critic wrote, "They raise villages and turn out the parishioners who are reduced to poverty." The Cistercians were natural businessmen. At Fountains, they bred a super sheep, which produced the highest quality wool in Europe. At Rievaulx, they moved into heavy industry. Another archaeologist, Jerry McDonnell, is trying to work out just how advanced their technology was.
What are you actually doing here?
What we've built here is a furnace that's based on one of the ones that we excavated further to the north at Billsdale, and it's basically an early type of so-called bloomery furnace that was the dominant method of producing iron in the 12th and 13th century.
And what are they doing with it?
They need their own supply quite clearly. Just to build the abbey itself, you need the steel tools, the chisels, the saws, etc. But also, for example, to shear the sheep, you need sheep shears, which are steel-edged tools. But the quantity that they're producing and the granges that they've got must have been producing far in excess of what they needed. So they were actually selling it on into the open market. The advantage of the Cistercians is they have a good European network. And so the ability for technological transfer within that group was very, very good. And so we know they were competent engineers. And so I'm sure that they were at the forefront of technology.
As the Cistercian monasteries grew wealthier, so their architecture got more elaborate and decorated. By the 14th century, they'd be picking out these arches with lines of red paint. And by the 15th, they were even throwing in the odd sculpture. Heavens above. And of course, no well-to-do monk wants to share a dormitory. So they all moved out and established individual bachelor pads, each private room with its own fireplace. You can see it's cut into the wall here. And a bedroom upstairs, complete with an ensuite lavatory.
And remember St. Benedict's diet? His monks weren't supposed to eat the flesh of four-footed creatures.
Monks, however, could eat meat if they were ill. So meat was available here in the infirmary. So, little by little, the brothers gave up eating in the refectory and started to take their meals here instead. Cistercian logic for you.
It was another loophole, just like the one that allowed monks to get around the no talking at meals rule by using sign language.
In fact, most of the signs were about food, which isn't surprising because in a monastery there was a lot of food to talk about. Here in Glastonbury, for example, the abbot's kitchen was one vast chimney. Every week contained at least one feast day in which the poor monks might have to deal with something like 16 courses.
The monks were equally serious about their booths.